Ladies and gentlemen, the red or the blue pill. The choice is yours.
Welcome to Light on Conspiracies, the place where truth and love transcend the darkness. Your host, Peace Award-winning researcher Ole Dammegard. To listen to this full interview, just go to lightonconspiracies.com and subscribe.
I'm here today with Mark Devlin, my friend from England, who's, I would say, a very remarkable man. He is outstanding in his area of research, and I think what he has found out when it comes to the truth behind the music business and media and the film industry as well, it is very, very important because it's something that most of us are not aware of, and it's affecting us on a daily basis. So I feel really honored to have you here today, Mark. Welcome, so.
Good to be with you, Ule.
We've been seeing each other from time to time in different countries at different conferences, and so I've been on your show as well. And I've always been fascinated by the things that you come up with. So would you mind giving us a little background about how you got to where you are today and how your topic caught your interest and so on?
Sure. Well, I've been a radio and club DJ for 27 years now. And when I first started out, I was strictly a music fan. I got into pop music from a very young age, about the age of 5. Bought my first record when I was 5. And my love of pop music when I was very little just made me want to become a DJ because I wanted to communicate the enthusiasm that I felt towards music to other people. So I don't want to make it sound easy because it's certainly not easy setting yourself up as a DJ with any level of success, but eventually I did manage to get myself on the map, and I started doing radio shows, and gradually I started doing gigs. First of all in my hometown of Oxford, then all over the UK, and then I was fortunate enough to get gig bookings all over the world. So I got to Australia, South Africa, the US, all over Europe, and I had many, many good years doing that. So the genre of music that I chose to represent was black music generally, and specifically R&B, hip-hop, reggae, a certain amount of UK garage, soulful house, funk, disco, all that stuff, you know, black music in its widest sense. And that served me very well for many years. And for all those years, I just went through the motions and did everything that was expected of you as a DJ. Playing the gigs, promoting the records. I met many of the artists, interviewed many of the artists whose music that I played, and I gave feedback to the record companies and the promo companies in terms of what tunes were working. And I was just a very good, obedient DJ doing everything that you're supposed to do. But things got to the stage by around about 2007, 2008, where I was starting to ask some questions about what was going on in the wider world. Because I'd always been someone that had thought outside the box. And I think that was one of the reasons why I got into the sort of music that I play. Because I grew up in a very ordinary, quite boring, very white, middle-class town in West Oxfordshire, where not a lot of people are into anything other than pop music that's in the charts. And I think because...
I was just going to say that you're not the typical black person in the street, are you?
I don't come from a council estate. I don't come from the ghetto. I'm not some Ute from the ends, you know, and I've never pretended to be. But I think because I've been somebody that can think for myself, and I was always encouraged to do that by my dad, who you met the other week at this event in London that we came to. You know, he's someone that always taught me that it's okay to not be like the crowd and to do your own thing. And I think it's because of that that I got into the styles of music that I play. And it's because of that that I've always been someone that has not just taken a mainstream account of something on face value just because some authority source has told me that it's that way. I've always been someone that's questioned. And so because of that, by round about 2007, 2008, I started to realize that the world is actually nothing like we're told it is by the mainstream media and by government ministers and mainstream sources. And this set me on a path to doing a lot of research. I started reading books, initially from the likes of David Icke. I devoured David Icke books, and they really woke me up to some great truths about what's going on and how things are not the way we're told they are. But it was other authors as well. And by 2010, it was as if a light bulb went on in my head at a particular point in that year. And I don't know what it was specifically that sparked that, but everything just seemed to make sense to me suddenly. And I was able to put all these disparate pieces together and understand the big picture of who's really controlling things in this world. And much deeper than that, what this reality is anyway, the true nature of it.
Can I ask you, when you started waking up like this, I mean, it's quite a transformation as a person as well. How were you met by your surroundings, family, friends, and so on, when you started waking up?
Well, it was difficult. There were certainly certain family members who couldn't understand what was happening to me. And I felt the need initially to evangelize about all these things that I'd come to understand. And I think that's probably a very common situation for a lot of people that will be watching this. When you come to understand these things, when it suddenly all makes sense, you feel this need to zealously kind of shout it from the rooftops and communicate what you've come to understand yourself to others. It was a very similar process to when I first got into the music that I came to play as a DJ. I was very enthusiastic about getting other people into the music as well. I wanted to sway them to like the styles of music that I liked. And there are lots of parallels between my awakening process and first becoming a DJ. Maybe we can get into some of these later on, but that was one of them. I really felt the need to speak openly about all this stuff to other people. And unsurprisingly, it fell on deaf ears with a lot of people. Many people thought that I'd lost my mind and that I was nuts. That's a very common thing as well that people experience. And certainly certain family members didn't get it. I lost certain so-called friends who didn't understand what was happening, and they didn't understand the stuff that I was starting to talk about, and they probably thought I was starting to become a bit dangerous to be around, and they didn't want to associate with me, and so I had to let a few of those go. Also, it became difficult just functioning in everyday life. And at the time, I was doing a bunch of gigs at certain venues where I'd reached the point in my DJ career where I was doing some gigs which I would prefer not to have been doing if I'd had any choice in the matter. But because it was my main source of income and it was my living, and I was using it to feed my family, I kind of had to make a few compromises, and I had to play a few venues where I was required to play music that I wasn't really into. You know, it was mainstream stuff. It was agenda music, as I call it. And I started to become very uncomfortable with certain records I was being required to play and certain styles, because I could see how these styles of music were being used for social engineering and mass mind control, and how they fitted into the big picture of culture creation and all this stuff that I now talk about. So eventually, after a couple of years, I had to start letting those gigs go. I had to knock them on the head, stop playing those kind of venues, stop playing that type of music. And that became difficult. And I went out and had to get myself a job, like a wage slave job as a driver, basically a glorified taxi driver, which I still do now to pay the bills, because there's not a lot of money in truth, Ule. I don't know if you've noticed, but you know, you get this often from people. People say, oh, you're only saying all this stuff, you're only putting these books out and doing these talks to make money. Yeah? Well, it just goes to show how little you understand about this area of work, because let me tell you, there's no money in it. So I certainly don't do it for the money. So Mark, I had to let a lot of that stuff go.
Mark, can I ask you, I had a standard question I ask everyone on this program is, how can we know that you are not controlled opposition?
Okay.
Nowadays, there's so many shills out there, and I just want to, nothing personal, I'm just asking everyone the same question. How can we know that you are not part of controlled opposition?
This is what I want people to do. I want you to go to Google or any other search engine of your choice and type in DJ Mark Devlin, and then you can put a bunch of keywords in of your choice. Links to Tavistock Institute, links to MI6, links to military intelligence, links to dark occult secret societies, any of that stuff. Put in my name, put in any other institution or organization or any other aspect of me that you might have your doubts about, and see what you come up with. good luck with it, because you'll be there for a long time. There's nothing to be found about me in terms of nefarious links, but don't just take my word for it. Do your research. I get emails all the time, and I get comments on Facebook threads and YouTube videos saying, you're a shill, you're an insider, you're working for military intelligence. Okay, prove it. Prove it to me. Let me know what you find. Come back to me. Give me the documentation that you find. But like I say, good luck, because you'll be there for a long time. But you have an open invitation from me to look into me and try and find any of this stuff.
I would also add, what would be the purpose? What would you gain from being part of? What would be the gain of exposing the things you are if you were controlled opposition? It doesn't make any sense to me. So very good answer, and I hope you didn't take it personal. Like I say, I ask everyone that, and it's very interesting to see the different variations of the answers. So
well, exactly. I mean, I've mused on this question myself, because I get the accusations. I'm sure you do as well. People would probably say, in response to your question, what would there be to be gained through me being some kind of agent? People would probably say that, like you hear with many other researchers, probably 90% of what I say is truth and checks out and can be verified, and 10% of it is disinformation put out there deliberately to lead people up the garden path. If that's what you think, fine. You know, I can't alter your perceptions, but prove it to me. You know, if that's what you think, give me the documentation, show me the 10% of the information that I put out which doesn't check out, which you think is disinformation, and, you know, let's see where it gets us.
Exactly.
That's all I can say.
Yeah. Listen, Mark, can I go back to your DJ days? Is it true that you were DJing for in 40 different countries or something like that?
I have, yeah. I mean, a lot of those are in Europe, so I've played pretty much all over Europe. But wow. I did play in the US, Canada, South Africa, Kenya, Botswana, Mozambique, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Dubai. So yeah, I've been around the block a few times.
That is amazing. That is amazing. But also, the reason I want to point this out is that it's not directly positive for your career, sort of like it was before when it was really taking off. This must have sort of put things to a bit of a halt for you. Yeah,
well, it has. You know, my DJ career is pretty much stalled. I still play a few odd gigs here and there, but the gigs I play now are really for people that I've known for many years. So they're tried and tested friends, they're close personal associates, and I just tend to, do gigs with them and play their events. I don't market myself anymore in the way that I used to. I used to be so hungry for gigs, and I used to be so into what I was doing. I absolutely lived for it. You know, if you'd asked me 10 years ago what my identity was in the world and what I was all about as a person, I would have said, I'm a DJ. I just live for that next party, that next booking, the next radio show, the next mixtape. Absolutely loved it. You know, the life was very much a part of me. But I have changed, you know, I've matured, and I think we're supposed to do that when you reach a certain age. You're supposed to kind of develop and evolve as a human being. And a comment which was made by Ian Crane a while back really resonated with me. You know Ian Crane, right?
Yeah.
So at one of his talks, he made the comment that if you're still doing at 50 years of age what you were doing at 30, you might have missed a trick or two about what life is trying to teach you and about what life is all about. So what he means by that is you're supposed to evolve, you're supposed to grow, you're supposed to go through different circumstances and experiences in life. You're not really supposed to be doing the same thing decade after decade after decade. And that certainly, you know, chimes with me. So I'm very happy with the path that I'm on now. A lot of the information that I deal with, as you do yourself, is obviously very dark and unsettling. And I wish things were some other way. But I'm happy to be doing the kind of work that I'm doing because I recognize that it's where I need to be in life. I recognize that now I've found my path. And I think for many, many years, when I was doing DJ gigs, it's tempting to look back at those days and think it was all wasted time. And all I was doing was partying and just fulfilling my own ego, and I wasn't really contributing anything positive to the world. But there's another way of looking at those years, which is that they weren't wasted. They were laying the foundations for what I'm doing now. So I'm able to write these books, and I'm able to do these public talks and do these radio shows and stuff because I can bring a certain amount of knowledge and experience of what happens in certain aspects of the music industry, which I wouldn't be able to do if I'd not lived that life for all those years.
No,
so
exactly.
I think I come with...
No,
Yeah.
it's your background that gives you the weight to your words. I think that is why it's fascinating to listen to, because
I think that brings the credibility, because yeah, you can have people making YouTube videos about symbolism in pop music videos, or about mind control and how that works, or about social engineering. And certainly a lot of the information they put out is very valid because they've done their research. But I think somebody that has worked in the industry for 20 plus years and has been to all these different countries, has met artists, has dealt with record companies, has some kind of inside knowledge of what goes on, is going to carry more credibility than some guy making a YouTube video, you know, just some anonymous name that you've never heard of. So I think that's the gift that I can bring.
But it's almost like you're a whistleblower, kind of coming from the inside and then starting to expose it from the inside as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of like a whistleblower, although I never worked at very high levels of the industry. So I was never a managing director or a CEO. I never ran a company. You know, I was never that high level. I was kind of on the fringes of that scene. But I was involved enough in it to be able to tell these stories with a certain amount of, you know, substance to them. And it's kind of fortunate that I didn't hold a very senior position in the industry, because can you imagine if I had worked for the BBC and I'd been a very high profile radio or TV presenter, me now coming out and speaking about all this stuff would put me in a rather more precarious position than I'm in. And if I'd been a very senior player in one of the major record companies, it would be that much more difficult for me to come out and talk about this stuff now. So everything seems to have worked out the way it needed to work out. And I can see that now. But along the way, I never could have done. I was just lost in a fog and a haze, and I was walking around in a mind-controlled trance for many years. But I guess it had to be that way.
Was it painful for you in any way to sort of start understanding what was going on? Because it must have been like a total 180-degree change of the way for you to see things.
It was difficult, and it continues to be difficult, because as I carry on doing this research, I learn more every day. I'm never arrogant enough to assume that I've reached a point where I know everything there is to know. And tomorrow, I'll know so much more than I do today. And today, I know so much more than I did yesterday. I'm learning every day. And I'm learning that this whole mess that I seek to expose in terms of the level of physical, mental, and spiritual enslavement that humanity is in at the hands of this small few that we refer to as the elites is deeper than I'd even imagined before. It goes so deep, it's just unbelievable. And I'm uncovering new layers to it every day. And particularly when it comes to social engineering and culture creation. And the notion, or the truth, I would say, that any kind of public figure, any kind of celebrity, any kind of fad, trend, movement, any aspect of people's everyday lives that you would care to look at have been manipulated in a very calculated way into being. So nothing like that in culture, in everyday human life, happens organically or by accident. It's all made to happen by certain groups, networks, individuals that specialize in creating culture and steering societies off in a certain direction. So I'm discovering more and more every day about how that is done. And it is devastating, because you realize that you've been duped and deceived all your life, and you have to realign and reassess your entire worldview, your entire paradigm of this reality. And that's too difficult for a lot of people to do. And I can understand why it is. And within the music business, it plays out at some much lower levels before it feeds into the bigger picture, you know. So for me, having been a big fan of hip hop, a very difficult thing for me to come to terms with was the fact that many of the artists that I previously looked up to and respected were absolutely corrupted and were absolutely in the pockets of these satanic corporations that control everything. A good example would be Jay-Z, who I think most people that are paying attention these days understand that Jay-Z is an absolute corporate stooge and puppet, albeit quite a high-ranking one. You know, there's rumors that he's a Freemason. I don't doubt that. There are suggestions that he's a part of this secret society known as the Boule, which is reserved specifically for black people. There's rumors that he's an occultist, a mind control handler. None of this stuff would surprise me from what I've looked at in my research. But it was very difficult for me to initially accept that he wasn't who I thought he was, which was simply this great rapper, this really talented MC that was one of the best in the game. He certainly is talented, and that is why they would have recruited him. But that was a difficult process for me. And so now I talk about all kinds of genres of music and all kinds of decades, all kinds of points in the timeline. And I've done a lot of work into the Beatles, and specifically Paul McCartney, or should I say Paul McCartney. We can get into that maybe. But a lot of people that were around in the 60s and that remember the Beatles and have a lot of personal nostalgia invested into that group are not hearing anything you have to say to suggest that the Beatles may not be all that we thought they were and that there may be more to know. People just aren't having it, because to accept that they may be a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, to suggest that they may have had links to military intelligence, to suggest that they were involved in dark occult secret societies is absolutely devastating to people of a certain generation. Because if they admit that, they have to admit that they were duped, they were taken in, they've been made mugs of, and people don't want to admit that. That's the power of the ego. The human ego, very, very powerful thing. And you get it with all kinds of groups. You know, you can talk about the Doors, Jim Morrison. It's been uncovered that Jim Morrison's dad was a Navy admiral, you know, and he was involved in the event that kicked off the Vietnam War. You get all these other groups from the counterculture scene of the 1960s, and they all have links going back to military intelligence and various aspects of the establishment. And people don't want to hear that because they don't want to have to face up to the idea that that whole counterculture hippie scene could have been anything other than this wonderful organic grassroots movement that we've been led to believe that it was. So I can understand why it's so difficult for people to come to terms with this information when they're first faced with it, but it comes down to the same old thing each and every time. You're either somebody that wants truth and is prepared to go wherever truth takes them, no matter how dark or unsettling that route may be, or you're somebody that doesn't care enough for truth and you're happy to go on living in a mind-controlled haze. You know, you're one thing or the other, and there's no middle ground.
I just want to take the, let me see here, take the occasion here to show Mark's book.
Here's mine.
There you go, Musical Truth. It's a thick book, and it goes in great detail through many of these things that we're going to talk about today. And I'm one of the people who grew up with the Beatles and so on, so it's been very painful for me personally to have to unlearn so much that I thought I knew in this area as well, because I thought, okay, when it came to conspiracies like murder conspiracies or false flag operations, starting wars and so on, I could accept these things. But when it came to innocent things like the Beatles and things, I had no idea. But I've had to open keep my mind open and start looking at the actual evidence. And the more I look, just like you, the deeper I go, the more I come back to exactly what you're talking about. And if it's hard for any listeners to grasp this, please understand, if you were one of the handpicked few that's trying to control the world, what areas would you focus on to hijack? I would suggest, if you're intelligent and with some strategic knowledge, you would focus on the areas that really matters to normal people, like movies, like music, politics, sports, these areas. is where you can get to normal people without them knowing it. And that is, in my humble opinion, also why they put a lot of focus in these areas and pumped their power through the veins into these industries. And when you also see how few people nowadays that controls these areas of modern life, you will start to see that it's actually possible, what Mark is going to tell us about, that these areas are being controlled and directed in their, according to their agenda, not for the benefit of us.
Well, that's right. It's ingenious what they've done, really, with the entertainment industries, because as anyone that is paying attention will know, we're controlled in so many other ways. You know, they've got a stranglehold over the whole banking and financial system, money as debt, you know, money created out of thin air, fiat currency, all of that. Very controlling over all humanity. Then they've got all the food and drink corporations. They're putting fluoride in water. There's Monsanto with all the GM food and all that stuff. We're being sprayed by chemtrails from the skies. We have vaccines and big pharma so-called medication, which is dumbing people down and making people stupid and very harmful to human health. Then you've got all the mind control and all the bullshit and all the propaganda that comes through mainstream media and the TV news and so-called newspapers. So we're controlled at every level through all these institutions, plus the world of academia, of course. Let's not forget universities, colleges, and all the misinformation and disinformation that's spewed out of many of these organizations. But then on top of all of that, you've got the entertainment industry. And that's where people go when they want some light relief from all the heavy burdens of their everyday life, all the drudge and the BS that they have to go through every day. So, you know, the average person is a debt wage slave that has to go out to some job just to be able to afford to live in their residence, you know. So they'll come home from work at the end of the day, they're tired, they're pissed off, they probably hate their boss, they maybe hate their job, they wish they could be doing something else, but they have no choice. And what do they do to unwind? A lot of people will put the TV on. They just want to absorb a bit of TV, watch TV for 3 or 4 hours while they eat their dinner, have a couple of drinks maybe before they go to bed, and get up in the morning and do it all over again. Then they hit the weekend. What do a lot of people do at the weekend? Go out and catch a movie, go to the cinema, watch the latest Hollywood blockbuster, some mindless escapism, you know, just escape the real world, enter into this world of fantasy and enjoy yourself for a couple of hours with a bag of popcorn. And then another thing that people do is when they're feeling stressed out, when they're wound up, they put on some music from their favorite band or their favorite artist. And they rock out to some of that stuff at home. And nobody is expecting to be mind controlled and to have their cultural value systems shaped when they do all this stuff. You're not expecting that from the TV, from the movies, and from music. You just see it as this fun, innocent thing to do. So isn't it an absolutely ingenious way to plant subliminal messages into the minds of the general population and to alter their belief systems, alter their values, rewire the whole way that they think about certain things by putting it all into these works of entertainment? And if you were a controlling social engineer who didn't have humanity's best interests at heart, and if you had an understanding of how the human psyche works and of how the nature of reality on a macrocosmic basis works, then would you not take the opportunity to use these industries for that very purpose? You would absolutely want to control them from the top down. You would absolutely want to dictate who become the key players in these industries. You wouldn't leave it to chance which groups were going to become the very biggest bands in the music industry. Would you let a group like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Jay-Z or Britney Spears or Katy Perry or any other name you might care to mention get that big and that influential on their own, off their own back, without any kind of interference from you and your groups? Well, you wouldn't. You know, you've got to get into the mindset of the individuals that we're talking about. They are dark occultists, they're Satanists, they don't think like you and me and like people watching this broadcast. Many of them have been subject to trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse from a very young age. And if people don't understand how those subjects all work, I would certainly recommend doing some research into satanic ritual abuse and monarch programming, MK Ultra mind control, and looking at the works of people like Jay Parker, Kathy O'Brien, Bryce Taylor, Fritz Springmeier, to get an understanding of all that. So the people that are instigating all this stuff don't think like us. They have belief systems and value systems that are entirely different to ours. And it's very difficult for the average person to relate to how they think. And just because we wouldn't do a certain thing and we wouldn't want to exert a level of control over the rest of humanity, you needn't think that that applies to them as well. That's the tactical advantage they have over everyone else, us thinking that way. So you've got to try and understand the mindset of these deeply psychopathic, deeply sick individuals. And I think a lot of your own work, Ule, bears that out. When you consider the mental state of people that can plan the kind of events that you expose, all these false flag terror events, it's clear that we're dealing with some deeply mentally disturbed individuals. But that is the case, and we have to face up to this if we're going to stand any chance of properly understanding what's being done to us and of bringing it to an end.
Yeah. I'm a personal friend of Chip Tatum, who's a CIA whistleblower, who's been part of false flag operations and also been an assassin himself on a very high level, the absolute top level, actually. And we've been talking about me not understanding the mindset behind what's going on in the world today, because it's absolutely mad. The mindset behind these actions are totally crazy, in my opinion. And he said, no. The only reason you don't understand it is because you are not a psychopathic killer. If you were that, this would make total sense to you. And he said, these powers that are behind this, what we see as monsters and evil and so on, it's just another day at the office for them.
Yeah. You see, when you get authors and researchers that look into serial killers, you know, Son of Sam, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, anyone you might care to mention, they will tell you that they really have to try and get into the mental state, the mind state of their subject. So if somebody's writing a book about Son of Sam, they need to understand what was going on in David Berkowitz's head, what would motivate an individual to do the kind of things that he did or is said to have done. And that's what a criminologist or an author into this area will do. Well, the rest of us need to be doing that. Everyone in society needs to be investing a bit of time and energy into understanding the psychopathic mindset of those who are controlling us, because we're all in their sights. We're all their potential victims. They want our children. We've got a transhumanist nightmare society and a police state with surveillance everywhere, just around the corner. And in many ways, it's already here. And if it's not stopped in its tracks, the kind of world that the next generation, our children, are going to have to grow up in is one that's not worth being alive in, quite frankly. So we have a last-ditch opportunity at this point in time to head this thing off if enough of us get engaged in that process. And part of that involves understanding how the enemies of humanity think. And I think it's a duty that we have to do a bit of research into that and to understand why they bother with things like subliminal messages in movies and pop videos, why they do things like predictive programming, why they do things like false flag terror events. There's not enough of us that understand all this stuff. There are many people on this path now, and it's very easy to do that research. We have this thing called the internet, which is available to everyone. It's our greatest gift. It's the greatest gift humanity has ever had to break free of this spiritual slavery that we find ourselves in. The opportunity is there if the will is there on the part of the individual to understand what's being done to us. But we need more people to get on this path. And, you know, people will get motivated by different things. There are parents who are getting concerned about vaccines because they're understanding that they're very harmful to human health and they're leading to things like autism. And there's got to be a reason why countries like Australia are now making vaccines mandatory for school kids. You know, why would a state government need to take that kind of heavy-handed approach if it weren't for the fact that people are starting to wake up and get wise to the fact that these things aren't as safe as we're told they are. So it may be vaccines that wake parents up to the fact that, you know, our governments don't necessarily care about us. It may be other things. It may be chemtrails or fracking or anything else that gets people on the path to the kind of activism that we need to see. But I think a lot of other people could be motivated and inspired by an understanding of what happens in the music industry and what's going on with Miley Cyrus stage shows when she's up there as a, you know, satanic pornographic slut, and she's got armies of 8 and 9-year-old girls in the audience absorbing all this stuff. It might be people coming to understand why there's Freemasonic symbolism in Britney Spears videos and Beyonce videos and Jay-Z videos and Kanye West and all this stuff. It might be people understanding how predictive programming and symbolism works in Hollywood movies and why it's there. Whatever the catalyst is to wake people up and get them on the path, it's a good thing, because that needs to happen to a much wider degree, I would suggest. So we're living in interesting times and we're living in challenging times. And I think the generation alive today, the generation of adults, our generation, bear an amazing responsibility on our shoulders in terms of deciding which way things are going to go from here. Because if we sit on our asses and do nothing and just don't care enough to get involved, then the nightmare scenario that I just referenced is waiting just around the corner. On the other hand, we have the best opportunity any generation has ever had to change the way things turn out, because it's all to do with our free will choices. Free will is always at play in creation, and we have the opportunity to shape the way things manifest physically for future generations based on our care and our free will. So it's all on us.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what I think is the good news is that it sounds like we're talking about that the whole world is evil. And I would suggest that both of us say, no, not at all. But there is like a cancer growth, a small little unity of the so-called elite. This is their name. They call themselves the elite. I mean, I have words that wouldn't be so nice, that would describe more what I really think of them. But they're very, very few, but they have so manipulated their way into so many of the, if not all of the important areas of life where they can control us. So at this point, whatever you look at, GMOs or chemtrails or vaccines or the music, this whole thing we're talking about now, or top political assassinations or false flag, it will lead you back to the same small group. If you dig deep enough, you will get to the same point. So it doesn't really matter what activates you, what gets you going. It's help for the whole, whatever you help to expose. So just like you say, I think we're in very challenging times, but also amazing times, because here is the chance to where we can really transcend this. But we need to unite and wake up. It is not a time to pick your nose and just change channels and say, well, a responsible adult needs to look at the news every day to be informed. That's the way to be de-informed. What do you call it? Desinformed, I think is the word. Yeah. Because the real truth will not be given to you through the black box. It is through these type of programs, different alternatives ways now through the internet. Thank God for the internet, just like you say. That is the only way at this point where we can find out what actually is going on. So,
yeah. And you might have to let some things go, as we were saying earlier. If you're really going to get engaged in the process that needs to take place, you might have to let a few friends go. You might fall out with the odd family member. You might have to change your job. You might have to reduce your income. And I know we'd all prefer not to have to go through these things, but they sometimes are inevitable consequences of what happens when you start to speak out and do the work that needs to be done. And many people have made very heavy sacrifices, much heavier than I've made. I know you yourself have lost personal friends. They've lost their lives You know, that's a major thing to have to bear on your shoulders.
I
And
had
many
to
other,
change country as well.
there you go. There you go. You know, Judith Vary Baker has had to move country as well because of how outspoken she's become about Lee Harvey Oswald and the truth about the Kennedy assassination. So people do have to make these major sacrifices. But I just want to pick up on what you just said about the controllers actually being a very small, tight-knit group. And when it really comes down to it, the number of those that are controlling the remaining billions in this world is so small, it's just completely ridiculous. And you wonder how they've ever been able to do it. The only reason they've been able to do it is because they stay united, they stay focused on a common goal, and they work together towards it. I'm sure there's a certain amount of bickering and infighting that goes on, but ultimately they stay focused on what it is they want to achieve. And it seems that the rest of us are not able to do that. And that's how they've gained a tactical advantage over us. Plus the fact that they've been doing this for a very long time. You know, this conspiracy seems to go back many thousands of years. Most researchers agree that it goes right back to the ancient world. And what we're seeing now is the culmination of many centuries of dedicated planning and implementation. But I just want to throw a couple of examples from my new research into the conversation here to reinforce this fact that it's a very small group of individuals that are doing all this controlling. And ultimately, all these paths lean back to these same individuals and these same networks. So you could plot it on a kind of family tree graph, and you could see all the different offshoots and how they all come back to the same source at the end of the day. So I'm writing my next book at the moment, Musical Truth 2, the follow-up. So I'm spending all of this year putting together information for that book. It's going to be out early next year. But it was very clear to me in writing the first book, there were many, many stories that I couldn't get into that first volume that still needed to be told. And if I tried to get them all into one book, first of all, the book would have been the size of a bloody doorstep. And secondly, it would have taken another 3 or 4 years to come out. And I just wanted to get the first volume out there as quickly as possible, get that information out into the world, and then concentrate on putting the rest of it out. So I'm looking at many of the dubious family connections between many prominent music artists and the worlds of military intelligence, aspects of the government, secret societies. There are links going back to serial killers, if you can believe it. There are links going into dark occult groups, and all kinds of expressions of the establishment. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples right now. There are many, many others. But I'm grateful to a couple of other people for bringing these across my radar in recent times. So there was a group in, I think it was the late 1950s or early 60s in the UK called the Tornadoes. They had a big hit called Telstar. And they were associated with a producer by the name of Joe Meek. And there's lots to know about Joe Meek himself as well. When you get into these stories, you find that there's links and threads and interconnected webs going off all over the place. And when it comes to Joe Meek, there's links to the murder of a rent boy by the name of Bernard Oliver, whose body was discovered in a suitcase in this horrific case in the 1960s. Joe Meek is, his name comes up often in that conversation. There are links going back to the Kray twins, these notorious gangsters in London in the 60s. And in turn, there are links from the Krays going into MI6 and other aspects of British intelligence. But just staying with the Tornadoes, somebody brought to my attention the other day, who had emailed me, the fact that one of the members of the Tornadoes was a guy by the name of Rob Huxley. And people's ears may prick up when they hear the name Huxley, because Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, was a eugenicist, a social engineer, and one of the main architects of the MK-Ultra mind control program. He was the son of Thomas Huxley alongside his brother Julian Huxley, and the two of them have been very much involved in this whole kind of mind control agenda over the decades. So you've got this guy Rob Huxley, who crops up as one of the members of this group, the Tornadoes, and he just happens to be a cousin of Aldous Huxley of Brave New World fame. What are the chances of that happening at random? Why would you expect this guy to pop up in a pop group if there wasn't something going on that we need to know about? Then another researcher whose work I'm featuring in this chapter on the punk and new wave scene. And he's done a lot of research into the family backgrounds of many key players on this scene. Brought to my attention the fact that Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters, who was previously a member of Nirvana, his father, James Harper Grohl, I believe his name was, worked in the office of the US politician Robert Taft Jr. And he is the son of one of the US presidents. And when you take it back to his grandfather, he was Alphonso Taft, who was the founder of the Skull and Bones secret society coming out of Yale University in the US. So you've got a prominent music artist whose dad worked for the grandson of the guy that founded Skull and Bones. Again, what are the chances of that happening at random? I don't believe any of this stuff is random. Okay, those are a couple of isolated examples. When my book comes out, and when you look at some of the research of other authors, you'll see that these links crop up time and time again. There are links to US presidents. There are links to Yale and Harvard. There are links to the CIA, the FBI, MI6, Tavistock Institute, Stanford Research Institute, the Frankfurt School. I personally would expect the fathers of most rock musicians, particularly when you get into heavy rock, punk, and new wave, to have been lorry drivers, construction workers, miners, manual workers doing working class jobs. That's what I would expect to find. So why do you keep finding the fathers of all these musicians that are playing all these scuzzy, rundown dive venues and living these gritty, edgy lifestyles? Why were their fathers diplomats and politicians and Navy admirals and generals and CIA agents? What is that all about? If you found one or two of these, or even 6 or 7, you could say, well, it's just the way it goes. It's just one of those things. It's just coincidence. But when it keeps happening, and in pretty much every case, when you look at the family backgrounds and some of the dubious sort of history of these individuals, you find links going back into these establishments. You come to realize that the entire industry is steeped in these kind of institutions, and that all these key players, all these prominent public figures that we get, all come from these kind of backgrounds, and they're all selected for these roles. So they're what's known as lifetime actors. And that's a phrase that was coined by Joseph Atwill, the author and researcher. He put out a book called Caesar's Messiah a few years back. Does a lot of work with Jan Irvin of Gnostic Media. You can check out their podcast called Unspun. They've done a lot of research into how social engineering works and culture creation. And they've just uncovered the fact that we have these lifetime actors everywhere. So sometimes they're put into the public eye as politicians. Sometimes they're put out there as business leaders like Richard Branson or Bill Gates. Sometimes they're put out there as Hollywood actors. They can be television presenters, and they can be rock musicians. But in each case, these people didn't get there through working really hard and crossing their fingers and having a bit of good luck. They were placed there, and they were placed there to play a role. And the role is always about changing society, steering people's perceptions and value systems and moral beliefs in a certain direction, and manipulating the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world and what's really going on. That's what these individuals are used for. That's how lifetime actors work. That's what culture creation and social engineering is all about. There's a lot of that upcoming in the next book, and the focus of most of my talks in the next year or two is going to be exposing how all this stuff works. I do find it fascinating, and I think it's time this information was put out there on a much wider basis than it has been so far.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's really appreciated for the rest of us to receive this type of information. I just want to confirm what you're saying, because it's in the field where I am, where it's mostly false flag operations, assassinations, serial killers, but also in your area, which I find fascinating as well. It is not once, not twice, not 10 times, not 15 times you find these links into military intelligence, or that the individual have grown up on an army base, a navy base, where they've been conducting different MK-Ultra, mind-altering experiments. It's not just once in a while. It's more or less you will find it, whoever you look into, when it's key people, you look into the background, because it's super important to find out who are these people really. And you will see it comes up again and again. And not only the fathers, often the mothers as well. And grandparents are involved in different secret societies, or in military intelligence, or MI6, or CIA, or you name it. What are the chances? And also, when you see, for instance, all of these groups that came out of Laurel Canyon, that just exploded. Laurel Canyon is like an absolute hole in the ground. There's nothing there. It's in the middle of nowhere, and that is where the whole flower power hippie movement, many of the great rock artists came from. A small little collection of houses. There's so few, and then right in the middle of it is the Lookout Mountain CAA big installation. What are the chances? You would think all of these long-haired, bearded hippies, they would stay as far away from these things as possible. But instead, we see it again and again, that they're the ones being backed, that these people come from nowhere, they can hardly play, and suddenly, in a very short time, they got record deals with CBS and big companies. They're supplied with super instruments, amplifiers, the whole kit, by established companies like the CBS and so on, that you would think, looking from the outside, that they would totally reject these groups and say, go away, we would never ever. But instead they're being backed. So like I normally use is Farmer Brown logic. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. There's a reason for this. There is a reason. Yeah. And so it's super important, these things that you expose, I think, to show the links and how the whole thing is put together. And also, I would say, to understand how these operations are totally compartmentalized. So many of the players are not even aware of they just know their little part of it. The whole picture is covered for them as well. It's only the few in the top that are pulling the strings.
I'm sure that's the case, yeah. And when you get into all these Laurel Canyon bands, and like I was saying earlier, there's a great deal of denial from people of that generation that remember those groups. You can present them with Dave McGowan's brilliant book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, where he lays out all these family links. And often people will say, well, in those times, in the 1960s, of course, a lot of the dads were involved in the military because you had the draft and there just weren't the wide variety of careers available back then. So the only option that was available for a lot of these men was to go into the military. Well, that may well be the case, but we're not talking about ordinary rank and file foot soldiers here. You know, many of these dads had very high ranking positions, very influential positions, generals, admirals. You know, you wouldn't expect to see that all the time. And if it were the case, just picking up on my earlier comment about why aren't the dads of punk rockers lorry drivers and coal miners? Okay, so we have all these family links from the music industry into the military and the military intelligence and the intel services and aspects of the government. Can you imagine if it were the case that all the dads of a particular music movement, all the fathers of the musicians were, let's say, farmers? For instance, you could pick any profession you want. I'm just picking farmers. So every single musician you look into, oh, the dad was a farmer, the granddad was a farmer. They have links to this farming company. They own a farm here, they own a farm there, the cousin owns a farm. Do you not think people would find that strange? And people would say, why are there all these links to farms? Why is there farming everywhere you look? Well, why do people not find it strange that there are links to military intelligence everywhere you look then? Is it not as strange that the links keep going back to these institutions everywhere you look? Is it not as strange as if it were the case with farming or anything else you might care to mention? So that's the way I look at it. Let me just give you another couple of examples that have come across my radar as well, in terms of how many of these family links are interconnected and involve quite high level players. So the Grateful Dead, one of the sort of hippie groups that emerged out of not Laurel Canyon, but San Francisco or Palo Alto, I think it was, in that whole hippie era. they created a whole generation of fans known as the Deadheads. So if you were a follower of the Grateful Dead, you were known as a Deadhead. I think there's probably a clue in the name there in terms of what that whole agenda was all about. And again, Jan Irvin, Hans Utter, and Joe Atwill have done great work into exposing the Grateful Dead and their links to the CIA and how they were involved in distributing a lot of the LSD that was on the scene back in those days. You know, people need to ask where this stuff came from. There was acid everywhere. Where did it come from? Well, it's been shown through documentation and through insiders that have come forward in subsequent years that so much of the LSD that was prevalent on that hippie scene and went hand in hand with all these festivals like Monterey and Woodstock and Altamont came directly from the CIA. They were putting it out there through agents such as Dr. Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, Michael Hollingshead, and many others. And the Grateful Dead were involved in that whole operation.
And a lot of it was handed out for free.
Exactly. It was put out for free. And that's where you get the phrase acid test, which has entered the common, you know, vocabulary. That was part of what Ken Kesey was doing with his Merry Pranksters crew when they were traveling around in this brightly colored psychedelic bus to all these hippie hangout spots in Haight-Ashbury and all these other areas of California, giving out free tabs of acid and giving out Kool-Aid laced with acid. And then they would study the effects of large groups of people, large communities, all under the influence of LSD and listening to all this psychedelic rock music. That's where you get the phrase acid test. So all this was done at the behest of the CIA. It was all a part of their MK Ultra program. You know, MK Ultra is a very far-reaching program. It's basically about mind control, but it has these different facets. So it's mind control on an individual basis when you get into things like monarch programming, which is trauma-based mind control. But it's also done on a collective basis with societies in terms of mass mind control and changing people's perceptions and value systems and stuff. And so the distribution of LSD was a big part of that, and the Grateful Dead played a role in it. So would anyone be that surprised to find out that one of the tour managers of the Grateful Dead, Alan Trist, I've got to remember which way around it was, but it was a guy by the name of Alan Trist, and his father, Eric Trist, was one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. What a coincidence. And the Tavistock Institute is all about social control, culture creation, you know, altering people's perceptions, changing culture. So you have a direct link back to the Tavistock Institute there. Then there's connections and links for days when you get into this information. And just remembering all the detail and being able to chart it all becomes a challenge in itself. But you also have Hank Harrison, who was associated with the Grateful Dead. He was, I think he was their publicist, or he was involved in arranging some of their tours in their heyday. Hank Harrison turns out to have had connections to the CIA as well. Why would that be a surprise? But he's also the father of Courtney Love, who was the wife of Kurt Cobain. And when Kurt Cobain turned up dead in 1994 at the age of 27, part of the 27 Club, in very suspicious circumstances, aren't they all? Hank Harrison went public to say that he believed his daughter, Courtney Love, had something to do with Kurt Cobain's death. You know, how crazy is that? Then you'll remember that you have the connection between Nirvana and the Foo Fighters via Dave Grohl, who was in both bands, and then you have the connection going back into Skull and Bones and stuff, you know, so there's connections for days there as well. And then Courtney Love is said to have brought in a whole load of the heroin that was very prevalent on the grunge scene coming out of Seattle during that heyday. And she also had a bit part in the movie which I watched the other day from 1986, directed by Alex Cox, called Sid and Nancy, all about Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols and his girlfriend Nancy Spungen, and this incident in the Chelsea Hotel in New York where Nancy was stabbed in the abdomen and died, and it was pinned on Sid Vicious, although many people think that he didn't do it, and then Sid Vicious himself died of an overdose a few months later. And you find that Courtney Love had a part as a New York punk in this movie. And then there's another parallel because Nancy is said to have brought in a whole load of the heroin that was involved in the punk scene in New York during her time with Sid. And she's said to have worked in conjunction with other musicians and with the CIA to get heroin into that scene. So connections and links for days. You know, the drug trade, the intel services, secret societies, all linked via the music industry, and all these connections going off in all kinds of different directions. Again, people might say a lot of it is conjecture, a lot of it is guilt by association. You're just reaching and you're pulling together things where there's no real pattern. But I would say, again, just to reinforce, when you get 5, 6, 8, 10 of these instances, you could write it off as one of those things. When it happens time and time and time again, and it becomes the norm, then I think there's something going on that we need to pay attention to. Another thing about all this information that I've just mentioned, all this stuff that's been brought across my radar by people that have reached out to me and other authors and researchers, is that it's all available in the public domain. I don't think any of this information has come as a result of people having to do deep digging in obscure libraries and uncovering documentation via Freedom of Information Acts and having to track down witnesses in obscure parts of the world and obtain statements from them. Most of this information is available via Wikipedia, via newspaper articles online. You get a lot from obituaries. Obituaries of key figures tell you a lot because they often delve into, you know, the life story of that person. You can learn a lot from reading online obituaries. But all this information is just stuff that's in the public domain and widely available to anyone via the internet. So it becomes a case of aggregating it all, bringing it all together and joining the dots, looking for where the patterns emerge, looking at where all the links come, and then getting the bigger picture in that way. That's what a lot of people are doing now. We have citizen researchers, you know, ordinary individuals. They aren't authors. They didn't study this stuff at university. They're just regular, ordinary people who in their spare time are bringing together all this information and researching it off their own back and coming to some amazing conclusions and then sharing that information with other people. And I'm very grateful that there's a whole army of people now doing that, because it's really increasing our understanding of this world that we live in and the true nature of how we're controlled and have been for a very long time. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's great that that process is now happening.
Exactly. I would like to add, if instead of military intelligence, if we were talking about connections to other groups, like if all of these connections had been to mob gangsters and mob families, what would your conclusions be if there were like hundreds and hundreds of people in these organizations with direct connections to mobsters? Wouldn't you react then? It's just because military intelligence, people don't really get the magnitude of what that means, that we don't react, because if you understand that, it's mind-blowing. Listen, Mark, we're coming to the end of the first hour, and could you please tell people how they can reach you if they want, or how they can support your efforts, or what you would like if people can do whatever for you?
Sure. Well, the one-stop shop for all my work is markdevlin.co.uk. So I have a couple of regular podcasts. I've got one called Good Vibrations, which is conversation-based, very similar to what we're doing here. I have another one called The Sound of Freedom, which is conscious music. That's where I put together a showcase of music that does speak to you, that does uplift you, that does resonate with truth, and it's the absolute antithesis to all the mind-controlling corporate garbage that we get everywhere else. So I love putting that together. You can access both of those via markdevlin.co.uk. They're hosted on my SoundCloud page, but again, the one-stop shop to it is via markdevlin.co.uk. I've got a YouTube channel as well, and there's lots of videos up there from my public talks and conferences where I show slides and I give images and really give people a chance to understand visually the stuff that I talk about. You can get all those on youtube.com/markdevlintv, whole host of them up there. Then there's the book, Musical Truth. Volume 1 is available on Amazon. There's a paperback, a hardback, or a Kindle version. And if you just do a search for that on Amazon, you will find it. If people want to purchase a copy of that from me direct, if they don't particularly like Amazon, who don't tend to be the most ethical company in the world, if you prefer to avoid Amazon, then you can reach out to me and I can post you out a copy direct. If you can pay by PayPal, just drop me an email, mark@markdevlin.co.uk. And as I say, I'm writing volume 2 right now. and I hope to have that finished by the end of the year. If I don't keep getting interrupted by these bloody interviews I have to keep doing. No, I'm joking. That's what I'm trying to do this year. So that book will be on the streets in the early part of 2018.
Excellent. Excellent. In the second hour, I hope you can go into more details about videos showing out all of these things that are hidden in videos and so on. And also maybe we can get into the Paul McCartney scenario and these type of things.
Can't do an interview without it, man.
Yep. Okie doke. See you soon.
Okay.
To listen to this full interview, just go to lightonconspiracies.com and subscribe. Give yourself the gift of truth and awareness while supporting Ole's hard efforts to get it out there.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.